to the final roundtable. My name is Massimo Fagioli. I teach in the theology department here. And I'm in charge only of being the traffic cop here. They don't know directions. I'm just here to warm up a little. This is how that works until 2:30, more or less. I will work as a warm-up for a few minutes, and then I will ask our panelists 2 questions, and they will have, for each question, more or less 5 minutes each. And after that, we will open up. Of course, my questions are just not teaching authority. Not you are totally free to, take off. I think they are important for the focus of this conference, that was teaching and understanding Vatican II, and so what we understand of the Council while teaching it, and vice versa. So, the Second Vatican Council at 50 years. The temptation for some of us might be sometimes to say that for the Second Vatican Council, 50 years is the new 30 or the new 35 or something. That's a temptation. Historians know that aging for a council, for Vatican II, as it was for Trent, aging is a very good thing. It brings about more vitality. So, at 50 years, though, we face a few questions that, again, become very interesting if we try to understand the Second Vatican Council and post-Vatican II in light of what was Trent and what was the post-Trent period. So, for us, are we living now in a Vatican II church? Or, as Karl Rahner said, in a world church? That for him didn't mean a non-Vatican II church, but it's a little different. Do we live in a period when Vatican II is just a major moment in an age that many theologians like Schuth have called a post-Constantinian church, where the church is on its own and has or should not have any political protection, or this kind of thing. So now, at 50 years old, it's important to reflect on the Second Vatican Council because we know fairly well, thanks to many historians, and especially to John O'Malley, that I have to say, in this last decade has literally resuscitated the debate on the Second Vatican Council. So we have a fairly accurate idea of what happened at Vatican II. We have some ideas as historians of what happened after Vatican II. I don't think we're thinking enough about what will happen to Vatican II. That's a big question, and for Catholics, lay Catholics, theologians, non-theologians, of every kind, this moment is important, I think, because sometimes talking about Vatican II exposes you to 2 kinds of attacks. Internally in the church, because in some quarters that's taken as an insult to official Catholicism in some quarters. Internally. And externally, because in some secular quarters, what they say when you make your case for Vatican II, what you hear, and I am Italian, so I could tell you a lot about anti-Catholicism, what they tell you is basically, we told you so. What were you expecting from Vatican II? So that's a very delicate moment for Vatican II Catholics, or for Catholics that still cherish that memory, or that teach Vatican II, where it seems that you do not, apparently that you do not have any friends. But that's on the surface. I'm very convinced that that Vatican II has changed a lot of things. Now, where we are now, and I want to quote a very short sentence from Yves Congar's journal. Yves Congar was probably the most important theologian at the Second Vatican Council. And by the way, Liturgical Press has just translated his council journal, which is a magnificent document that gives a lot of hope when you need that. And the day after the end of the council, on December the 9th, 1965, he described what was his life at that moment. And I quote, "What a desk. I have stacks of books and journals everywhere, on the table, on the chairs, on the floor. What a job." So he was talking about his desk, but he was talking also about what was going to happen in the church, and what I'm not quoting is the following sentence in that journal, where he had not so flattering words about some cardinals of the Roman Curia. But I encourage you to buy that journal because it's really worth it. And gives a lot of hopes. So, before...
what page he wants to know.
Before asking my first question, I want to thank our keynote speakers, because I've seen in their interventions yesterday, Thursday evening, and this morning, a red line, and I think that you share my impression that Archbishop Flynn has become one of our keynote speakers. And that red line was the word and the idea of reconciliation. So that was John O'Malley's idea that Vatican II had this deep yearning for unity. And yesterday, Bishop Flynn talked about how much reconciliation we need in the church, in the Catholic Church, in this local church. Michael Joncas talked yesterday about different ways to interpret the liturgical reform and how we need to share something and to be charitable in differences. And this morning, Sister Maureen talked about how important it is to be Vatican II Catholics, but happy Catholics, which is an extremely powerful teaching tool I've discovered myself. And this morning, Sister Katarina was, emphasizing how different the approaches are according to generations to Vatican II, to that thing, and how we are working to reconcile different generational approaches. So that's there are many motives that make me happy for this conference, but that the red line that I see in many panels about reconciliation, it's the best possible outcome that I was looking for, I think. So that's my thank. And at the end of this roundtable, the chair of our department will give you some more formal thanks. So that's I wanted to anticipate that. Now, for our panelists, and I repeat, feel free to ignore my question if you don't, if you have something more important to say. Okay. I'm a lay Catholic, so you can ignore me as So, question number one. In these last 50 years, we have read those documents, or the most important chapters of this document. We have taught these documents. So in these last 50 years, in light of the signs of the times of 50 years ago, and in light of the times of the 80s, in light of our times after 9/11, what can we now say that in these 16 documents is now more important, more relevant, more urgent, and or less less relevant. I found that in my teaching experience here, I've learned a lot about that because it's not my home country, because it's another language. But I think that that is a hugely relevant issue also for hermeneutical purposes when we try to understand the thing. So I would start with Sister Katarina, and then I will proceed with, please.
Okay, so,
Please.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, here, take the whole thing.
okay. All right. Okay, so which documents? You know, in some sense, I look at the list and I'd say everyone is important. And then I look at the world and I say, oh my goodness, what's so important is, you know, unity of all things about religion, the Muslim, Christian conflicts that are going on, our lack of understanding of each other, even as Christians. So I'd say, okay, so those are some of the documents that certainly would be important. The decree on ecumenism, but also the one on, fortunately, I have my list here. Okay, but that's good enough. And then I think you could look internally to the church, and you would say, okay, what's really important? Well, maybe Christus Dominus, the decree on the bishops, you know, and some of that Maureen was mentioning this morning, what might constitute another reason for meeting. Internally, the liturgy is certainly another one. So at that level, there's another kind of interest. And then more personally, I would say, what has changed in my 50 years of religious life? What has made the biggest difference? Of course, Perfecti Caritatis has made a huge difference and now sets us at odds with, you know, some parts of the church. But the other one that probably affects everybody in some way is Dei Verbum, and an understanding of Scripture, praying, meditating, reflecting in a way to understand the life of Christ that I would have never understood had that document not been part of it. So I would just say there are levels. It depends on which group you're speaking of.
A quick follow-up also for, to what kind of documents students are more receptive now than 40 years ago, 30 years ago, or less receptive, or hostile, or yeah.
You know, I'm not sure they know, most of them don't know the documents well enough to be that specific, but I know that on ecumenism and interfaith matters, it's very hard to talk about those things. There just is no experience or very little experience with it, less and less experience. For example, about 20 years ago, 24 of, let's say, 40 seminaries required a clinical pastoral education in an ecumenical setting almost always. It's down to 8. You know, it's just dropping off because students object to being challenged. Seminarians object to being challenged in contexts where, you know, they feel insecure, unable to answer a question, and so on. It might have something to do with the placement of it. So that's one thing. You know, in some ways, my colleague is here with Sacred Scripture. Dei Verbum, I don't know that there's total hostility to it, but there's certainly the historical critical method is being challenged more than it used to be. But still, there's something about the broader thing. Same thing with the Constitution on the liturgy. It depends on which of Michael's models.
Thank you. John?
Oh, you gave us freedom, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, then let me start with a commercial. There's a book coming out in December on the Council of Trent. And yeah, the title is Trent, What Happened at the Council. And this is a very significant title, and I'm trying to make a distinction between Trent and what happened at the council, because if you read the conclusion, I try to show what the council did, and then almost immediately how it was interpreted and began to be implemented. and this is within 10 or 15 years after the council ended. So you see how these events get wittingly or unwittingly, for good reasons or bad reasons, manipulated. So it's a good case study for us regarding Vatican II. First of all, these events are not easy to interpret, and then they're complicated, and then they have to go through the hearts, minds, wills, fears, and so forth of the people responsible, and they get translated. So I want to make that point. Second point I want to make before I get to your question, Massimo, is last night Michael made, I think, a really extremely important point about the decree on the liturgy, that it always begins with a doctrinal statement. And for me, this is a real key to how to approach Vatican II, because we describe Vatican II as a pastoral council. And this was a ploy used during the council to kind of get some things through, and it's today used as a way to kind of diminish the importance of the council. Well, it was just a pastoral council. Well, all the councils except possibly Vatican I were pastoral councils. And some of them were also doctrinal councils, but they were all pastoral councils. So, but Vatican II, as well as being a pastoral council, was also a teaching council. It had doctrines that it taught. I mean, collegiality being an obvious one. So it's teaching all the way through. So I think that's a point which we simply must never forget in trying to interpret the council. Now finally, to Massimo's question. In my mind today, kind of looking at the whole situation, Nostra Aetate, the decree on non-Christian religions, for me absolutely stands out after 50 years as the most important document of the whole council, and the one that we really are paying attention to on the official level, and needs to be paid attention to given the world situation, and especially the problems with the Muslim world. I mean, I think what the council really did, the Nostra Aetate, was give the church a new mission. And it was a mission here of reconciliation among religions, and now especially with this Muslim situation, especially with the Muslim world. And as I mentioned the other night, I mean, John Paul II was very good at this, and Benedict tries to do what he can. But and for me, and this then, if we really did that and took that seriously, there's a trickle-down effect to the rest of the council, to all the other aspects of the council. So that stands out for me as just absolutely numero uno. And I can't really answer the second part of Massimo's question because I just don't have that much experience.
Sister Mo?
And so I'm going to dare to, right? After he doesn't, okay. There are a couple of things I wanted to comment on. And I am going to quote my colleague to the left of me here. At some point you said in one of your works that I probably plagiarized somewhere, I'm not sure, but you said, for the first time the council, and I think this is why, I'm getting to the question of why, I'm actually answering his second question first. How do we keep it from becoming a mausoleum? All right, but, and then I will get to the first. But at some point John O'Malley said, I think it was you, for the first time, perhaps in a long time, the Council Fathers became aware of their own immortality because they realized they were not issuing the final word on anything. There was a sense of humility. Was that you that I'm quoting? Does that sound like something you would say?
Go ahead.
Oh, okay.
It sounds good, I'll claim it.
Okay. I am so sure it was he because I sadly am a groupie of John. All right, so I know everything he has said. But it was there were two things. First of all, he said they became aware of their own immortality by just the use of language that they were using. It was they were approaching the truths of the faith and the teachings of the faith in a way that they were almost in awe of what had gone before. There was a real appreciation for what they were dealing with. It wasn't pro forma. And so for the first time, this awareness of their own immortality provided a different approach to the way that they would respond, and therefore the kind of language that was used in the Vatican II documents, which is a more persuasive language rather than a more dictatorial or more, rather than a language of obligation, like you must, you must. Jesus never coerced, so we learned that lesson. And so I think this awareness of their own immortality entered into their conversations and clearly into their deliberations and in their votes. There's something else that I wanted to say that, and I will get to the document that shines out for me the most. I know that Lumen Gentium, or I should say I believe that Lumen Gentium is the centerpiece theologically of the 16 documents, in that so much of the theology that was at the heart of Lumen Gentium provided the foundation for many other documents that borrowed out of Lumen Gentium. But its partner document, which is never even on the docket when John the 23rd was alive, and which, according to some scholars, mirrored John the 23rd most, even though he wasn't even alive when it came out, is Gaudium et Spes. It is, in fact, my favorite document for a number of reasons. I understand John's appreciation for Nostra Aetate, for the phenomenal impact that it would have on it was a change that we would never have anticipated. But for me personally, as a theologian, Gaudium et Spes took what M.D. Schuth believed, and that was an incarnational theology that is at the foundation of that document, that God is mirrored in our universe. And for me, that becomes a real sign of hope. And so this looking for the signs of the times, this recognition that, you know, some of the Council Fathers did not like Gaudium et Spes because they felt it was too optimistic. All right, that we didn't have enough of a focus on the cross and the crucifixion and on suffering. And I don't know about you, but my everyday life gives me sufficient focus on all of those things. But to know that the faith that I espouse and the faith that I am looking to share with another generation is one that is filled with grace. Maybe I'm Rahnerian at heart, Karl Rahner, and I just can't dismiss that. But for me, this world is a world of grace, and I think Gaudium et Spes was the document that not only did it take an optimistic view of the human condition, but I loved what it did on two theological fronts. In the past, as many of you know, we theologians were encouraged to take what is called an apologetic approach to theology. You start with the divine, or you start with the general truth, and then you simply impose it down below. You know, God is good, God is all forgiving, God is all perfect. And we found that line in Scripture that said, you know, therefore be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. And we said, well, now we know how humans should act. And then we caused all that grief and all that guilt because humans are not God, all right? And so inductive approach to theology says, do like we do in every other realm of living. We don't teach long division in first grade. We start with addition, subtraction, and multiplication so that they're ready to do. And that's what Gaudium et Spes did. It said, we want to show you how the world could make a difference, how the church could make a difference in your world. But before we do that, we need to learn about your world. And I loved that humility on the part of that document. The other thing I will say about Gaudium et Spes and the others is that not only did they issue theological statements, but then they gave the theological rationale for it. So in Article 22, when they talk about how everyone might be saved, it doesn't just say because we said so. It says because Christ died for all men and women, we ought to believe. And so there was this theological rationale. Thank you.
Michael?
Three things. First, and I told Massimo I was going to do this, in a desire for reconciliation, I want to make an apology for something I did last night. Humor is always dangerous, and I discovered that a line I tossed off was taken by some hearers in a way I never intended. So I want to acknowledge this. I quoted my good friend, teacher, Father Bob Taft, with a line that said, what more do you want from the liturgy than to the incomparable privilege of praising the living God? but some folks thought that I was ridiculing a group of folks, actually part of the local church. They thought I was ridiculing St. Joan of Arc and maybe even the spirit of St. Stephen's. That wasn't even in my mind. I had no thought of those communities whatsoever. Frankly, had I been thinking of those communities, they would have been in the enculturation model that I was talking about. So for those of you that heard that and were offended, please accept my apology. Humor's always problematic, always problematic. So in the light of reconciliation, okay? Now, on to response. Response number 1. Back to those 4 goals in Article 1 of Sacrosanctum Concilium, I suggest 2 of them ad intra, 2 of them ad extra. I think I'd look at the documents exactly the same way. In terms of ad extra, I completely agree, Nostra Aetate, the big one. And secondarily, Gaudium et Spes. Gaudium et Spes more for the structure, Nostra Aetate directly for its requests, but Gaudium et Spes more for the desire to read the signs of the times, and then this magnificent listing, culture, human life, the struggle of war and peace, marriage and the family. I mean, the fact that we would want as a church to ponder those quote-unquote secular realities in the light of faith. That's just stunning. So that's the ad extra part. The ad intra part, I'd look at Lumen Gentium and, again, the document on the liturgy. But Dei Verbum, without that, I don't think the others would work. Without this recourse to the font of Scripture, I don't think the others would have the same cachet. Okay. Now, the last one, and folks, I noticed, haven't really addressed this, but it's the problem of how you communicate this, in my case, to undergraduates, right? It's different for seminarians, perhaps, or graduate students. Well, number 1, even if you give them these documents, they are written in conciliarese, and none of the students I work with can read this. They are incapable of reading. You saw last night how long one of the Latin sentences is. So even in the translations we have, which break down the long Latin sentences into 2 or 3, even then it's more than their brains can handle. So to try to give them the original texts, you're really working like an exegete. Just like with the Scriptures, you can ask them to read it, and they may get a sense of what's going forward, but to actually walk through it with them, line by line, is almost necessary in the teaching. Now, the harder question, I'll do it from liturgy. One of the things I absolutely love is, and I play with this, what is the liturgical enculturation for the new generation? The ending of our prayer. We're used to, forever and ever, amen. The new is, whatever and ever. Right. So what we have to be attentive to is that these words, which had a certain cultural cachet 50 years ago, are not read the same way. This is a new economic situation, a new global situation. The reference that we had to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Cuban Missile Crisis is dead history for them. But terrorists, right, that's profound for them. What's going on in Afghanistan? What's going on? That's profound for them. So when you read War and Peace and fear for nuclear annihilation, it's not because states like the United States versus Russia, the free world versus the communist bloc, that's not in their minds. It's rogue states and terrorists. And what does the church have to say to that? That's the issue. So to be attentive to just how far history has moved, to get them engaged with this. So enough on that.
Thank you. The second and final question is this. It's not a provocation, but it's serious, I think. We sometimes hear that Catholics still emotionally or intellectually and theologically attached to Vatican II, they could become a kind of conservative Catholics. Catholics who have very few ideas about what's next. And so the question is, how can we effectively keep that memory alive without making of that memory a memorial, which in the American experience are much more popular than in European experience. I mean, memorials in European history are dead history. So so where do we start when we talk about Vatican II? Do we start from collegiality, for example, which was typical in the 70s, 80s, and that, in my opinion, doesn't really appeal to students now. But that's my impression. So how can we keep that memory alive without building a mausoleum, a museum, with our projections of that event? Yeah, Sister Katarina.
I think I'd like somebody else to start to do this one.
Okay.
Moving right in. I haven't thought about that question in any length, but I mean, it seems to me, again, just what you were saying, start with the present. Start with what they're concerned about. And again, I'd hate to come back to Nostra Aetate, but Nostra Aetate is the question that does kind of deal with this question of rogue states and how do you deal with the tense international situation. So that would be my one way to do it. On a broader level, I really feel that my generation, we do have a tendency to memorialize the council, and we do have a tendency to try to recapture and pass on the enthusiasm. Well, you can't do that. That is past. It's in the past now. It's moved from experience to memory. It's moved from experience to history. So we have to realize that. And I think then, if we take a look at in teaching the documents, I agree with Michael, these are extremely difficult to teach. They're committee documents, and there's something in there for everybody, therefore, and if you don't have the right hermeneutic, you can prove anything from it. And was it Katarina, or I forget whether it was Katarina or Maureen, the students don't want to talk about how to interpret the documents. Well, good, they should. So we really need to go into the classroom with a clear hermeneutic of how to interpret them and try to show that to students so that you've got a basis. It doesn't just mean anything. There is such a thing as the spirit of Vatican II, and it can be recaptured. So that's the first point. And the second point is to insist upon the authority of conciliar documents, that they are not up for grabs, that sure, they have to be interpreted, they're open-ended and so forth, but this is the highest authority of the Catholic Church. And therefore, I don't almost say take it or leave it, but I mean, it seems to me that that point really has to be made and made clearly. Thanks.
Thank you. I want to second something that John just said because it's really important, and it sort of ties in with something that Michael said, at the end of the Mass, how did you say it? Whatever and ever. Those of us who are engaged in the education of undergraduates do come across something on a very, I think, regular basis, and that is because they have grown up in a rather, and when I say liberal here, I do not mean as opposed to conservative. I mean open, progressive. America wants to be progressive in thinking and allowing room for everyone. Because of that, I think students do not walk into our classrooms, as John just noted, with any indication that there's a level of the Catholics being bound to accept the teachings of these councils, of these documents. And so I think, without coming across as heavy-handed or anything like that, I think that's one of the things that might be one of the gifts we give to the next generation, that we're not saying better, we're not saying less, we're saying distinctive. That there is something distinctive that we are offering in this story and in these documents, and we invite you to read them in light of that, but understand something. Someone, I think yesterday, I'm not even sure because I've been listening to so many things the last 2 days, but someone mentioned the hierarchy of truths. My guess is that there are far too many Catholics in the church today who are not aware of the existence of the hierarchy of truths, that the church, our official church, can teach at the level of dogma, at doctrine, and discipline. And so, and whereas, I tell my students, because I'm from New England, if Benedict XVI said tomorrow that the Red Sox were going to win the World Series, I know a lot of Catholics in Boston who would mortgage their homes, all right? And because they think that he can't be wrong, all right? And so there's a lot of, I don't want to use the word ignorance, but a lot of conceptions about how to approach the teaching of the church and understanding the church that we've got to break through before we even break open the document, and introduce them to the conciliaries. But I think John makes a very, very important point in that, in this regard, that there is something very solid, very solemn. This was a moment in the history of our church that can continue to live, all right? And he also made another point that I would simply second, and that is, yes, it is history. It did happen 50 years ago. Can we ever totally recapture? Shall we all go to, Woodstock and, whatever? I'm thinking probably no. But the point is, it was a different time, it was a different audience, but isn't that what the gospel was all about? The gospel was written at a different time for a different audience who had different questions, who had different thoughts, and yet we've been told forever that the gospel is meant to address men and women of every generation. Now, I'm not putting the Vatican II documents on the level of the gospel, but I am saying that there are some moments in church history that can have a message for another generation. And I think since we have failed to sufficiently grasp what that message was that was given to us in completion in 65, that's why we're still doing it right now. And I will conclude with something that John will love, and that is, in my Vatican II course, is he making a face over here? Oh, okay. I wasn't sure, because I'm used to my students doing that. But in my Vatican II course, and with the conciliaries and all the big words, and they're reading Massimo's book, The Battle for Meaning, and they're reading my book, and I'm giving them all these really serious books to read and whatever. And I'm thinking, and I made them sign this a form saying, I read the syllabus, I accept the syllabus. I really became like a monster this year, because I didn't want people coming to me in December and saying, well, if I knew that's what you wanted for class participation. No, there is no ignorance now. You are going to sign this now, all right? My office is wallpapered. Anyway, first question, first day, this girl gets an A, all right? She says to me, I'm really stuck on one word in the reading from Dr. Fagioli's book, all right? Not even Sullivan's book, it was Fagioli's book, all right? What does he mean by that whole hermeneutics thing? And I thought, oh, I got one, okay? Because that is the key word. What hermeneutic are we going to go to each of these documents so that we don't make it just say what we want it to say, but what the Spirit hopefully engendered these gentlemen in the 60s to put these words on paper, and what might they say to us today in a legitimate way without imposing my prejudice on those words. I don't want to just say, it says it because Maureen says it. I want to say, I think I'm bringing a correct hermeneutic in order to interpret this, and I feel safe in passing this on to my students. Theologians have that responsibility to our students.
Michael or Katarina, do you want to? Please.
I would have two, I think, quite different points. One is we've talked a lot about the classroom, and that's where all of us are, I guess. And we're all talking about Catholic college classrooms. But you know, the vast majority of Catholic people, students and otherwise, are not in Catholic colleges or in college, perhaps. So I would turn to the parish. And I was on Cardinal Bernardine's original, the Catholic Common Ground project. And after that, when it got started, I went to a parish almost every week for about 3 years, around here and across the country, actually. And that idea of dialogue, and it just touched people so much. And around here, especially, the pastors asked me to come to talk to their parish councils about how you would dialogue and get at what the issues were in their parishes. Just lots of things like that. And then it trailed off. We forget things, that's for sure. So I think, pertinent to a point that you made, Massimo, it's a way of connecting with the people on where they are, what their issues are. So I think in parishes we could really do a lot if we were invited to do it. So then we get to my second point, and that is I still have some hope. There's going to be a new program of priestly formation in 2015. And for the first time in the 30 years that I have been working on seminary things, I have been closely invited into the secretariat at the Bishops' Conference by the person who's in charge of this. And this work that I've just been doing all summer, he is very interested. And I can't help but hope that he will notice, and he has already because he's told me he has, that the turning to the documents, that is the place to go. If we take one apostolic exhortation and the Code of Canon Law and make that kind of the rubric for how we're going to design the next program of priestly formation, I think that's unfortunate. I would love if we could get the next committee to return to the documents and to look at them and see what applies to today's church. So those are my two little thoughts.
Thank you, Michael.
I think I'd go back to where I ended last night and then make a second point on that. I think it was Gaudium et Spes 4 and saying that the church in every generation must make available to humanity the possible meaning of life in this world and the possible meaning of life in the world to come. I think that's just stunning. That's our task. It is evangelical. We embody it. It's just wonderful. Now, the second point I make is I think Rick Gallardi, in an article written for Worship some years ago, put his finger on the struggle, I think, our students, right, underneath the veneer, underneath the sophistication, underneath the earbuds, etc. I think they are passionately looking for community. The longing for human contact in a world of easy hookups, looking for something much deeper, much realer. I think that really is impelling them once you get deeper than the surface. So the world of human community and the world of transcendence, I really believe that. And the problem is we tend to split them. We tend to say that transcendence can only be found alone. And we tend to say that community will never bring you to transcendence. And the church's wisdom is, in community we find transcendence, and the transcendent God calls us to community. That's part of the beauty of this. So to bring that's I think part of the message that the church brings to the world. What we're about in this trajectory through history is transcendence manifested through human community. I think that's something wonderful. And I hope that's answering your question.
It is answering my question, yes. Thank you very much. I ran out of questions, but I'm sure that the audience has many questions. We have almost half an hour, 25 minutes. So there are two microphones, if you don't mind. If you want to introduce yourself with your name. And you can ask the question to one of our panelists, all of them. And they can interact, of course. They can.
Thank you. I'm Alan Schreck, Franciscan University of Steubenville. I want to thank everyone here, and especially the keynote speakers. I'm one of those, like most of you, many of you, I've been teaching this for 35 years at college. I made this when we designed our master's program in theology 30 years ago. Vatican II is a required course. And I don't know how many students have come to me, and I'm the main teacher, who say, wow, thank you, Dr. Schreck, that you exposed us to Vatican II, because it really has made a difference. My question is, and I was privileged to be asked to give one of the papers in the workshops on Vatican II and the new evangelization. And a lot of people have expressed concerns. I've heard a lot of concerns about, the failing to live out collegiality and the role of women in the laity. And of course, I agree with many of this. But my concern is, the last couple of popes have called us to this new evangelization, that we have a mission to the world to bring Jesus Christ as light of, the beginning of Lumen Gentium. Christ is the light of humanity. I know a couple of our speakers, you said that Nostra Aetate is the key document. I think that is a very important document. But my concern is that in our culture today, people are losing the sense of the missionary mandate. And they don't, I heard very little this weekend, except in my talk maybe, about the document on missionary activity. I was noting even in these petitions at the Universal Prayer at the Mass we had, there were very good petitions, but nothing about, and as Joncas taught us, we have a mission to bring Christ to all the nations. And we know hermeneutics is important, and I approach the documents this way, and I try to say, well, in these documents, I don't like to call them compromises, I like to call them balance. And, we have, like in Nostra Aetate, it even says we have to bring the gospel to everyone. And in my talk, I went through Vatican II and saw in the laity document, in many of these documents, it talks about the mandate to proclaim Christ. And nowhere in the documents does it say anywhere that we're not to bring the gospel of Jesus Christ to, I'll get to the point.
To whom are you asking the question?
Anyone who wants to respond. And it doesn't say anywhere in the documents that there's any particular group or individual or culture that we're not to bring the message of Jesus Christ to out of love for their salvation. We have to do it in the right way. We can't be imposing everything the council teaches. But I fear, and when I brought this up in my talk, in my talk,
we get your question. Okay.
Okay. My question is, so many Catholics, I've heard even in responses to my lecture, say, I can't proclaim Jesus Christ today, either because I don't find it in Vatican II, or because I'm so hurt because of something in the church and priest abuse or this and that. How can we proclaim Jesus Christ? How can the church credibly do this today?
Okay, thanks. Who wants to?
Sorry, I waited a long time.
I just want to affirm something that you said, namely that the proclamation of Jesus, I'm going to push it a little bit, the proclamation of Jesus as Lord. I mean, that kind of classical formulation, which says something about a first century Jew who lives his entire life, and we point to that particularity of that particular human life now as risen Lord and Savior of the entire cosmos. I mean, that is the distinctive Christian proclamation, I think. Now, you've also brilliantly said, how do you do it? What's the means by which that kind of evangelical mission, that central proclamation is done? And I think we're in this process of frankly, discussion, conversation, that there are some things, the documents have said, have not been particularly effective. Warfare to convert people to Christ doesn't seem to be effective. On the other hand, witnessing to Christ by the holiness of our lives, by direct charitable activity, by the attempt to change unjust institutions, by direct evangelical contact, by all sorts of things are listed. So I, in a certain sense, I apologize. Perhaps yesterday I should have said more clearly the business about the mystery of Christ. Remember, that's one of the things that's said in the very second article of Sacrosanctum Concilium. That's what the faithful manifest by their living and by the work of the liturgy. So, is that coming close?
Anybody else? Please, Katarina. I see many questions coming, so I really beg you to keep your answers and questions short.
Yeah, actually, I just wanted to say one little phrase, and I don't have the exact, or there are many different ways it's translated, but it's the Franciscan thing, and since you're at Franciscan University, preach the gospel always, said Francis, and if necessary, use words. Witness, as Michael said.
Okay.
Is this on? I have a question about...
Introduce yourself. She's my student.
I'm Bridget Galvin. I'm a theology student here. I was wondering what we should do about the role of women in the church, especially in the light of the recent condemnation of the nuns and also by the inquiry of the U.S. bishops into the Girl Scout organization. Anybody can answer.
I think
I don't find that funny.
that I think
this is a women's question.
Although I did like your response. I love the fact that Bridget asked this question because Bridget and I have had an ongoing conversation since I got here, at least today, and I know that this comes from her heart, and I know that she's genuinely searching, and so this is not a case of where someone has just got a chip on their shoulder and say, what about women, so to speak. No, this is a young lady, I believe, from what I've observed, who wants to live out her life in a way that is Christian, woman, and beautiful. And so I very much admire that the question comes from you, Bridget. I think sometimes there are times in the life of the church that are not as comfortable for one group as they might be. And clearly, the recent visitation and the recent discussion that came up between the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith and the LCWR was painful for many religious women, some more so for some than others. We each tried to address it in our own way, and I just think, for one thing, the more one understands how and why something like this can happen in our church, which appears to the outside world to be a deliberate affront, or because there were those who were sticking up for the nuns and why are you doing it? My point is, there were those who looked at it and said, this is a direct affront. I don't believe for a moment that it was ever intended to be a direct affront, because as I've often said, even when I go back and I study the council, every man there, I believe, loved his church, though they were violently against their interpretation of certain issues. And so I don't think that it was I want to believe that it was well-intentioned. So I think it's unfortunate what happened, but I think female religious will become stronger. And it caused us to look amongst ourselves and have deeper discussions so that we can make our ministry that much more real and that much more convincing. It gave us an opportunity. It gave us the stage for a moment, and some very wonderful women took the stage, and I'm very proud of them. So I hope that peace will come from it.
Thank you.
I'm going to jump in. I really find that looking at the history of the church, I'm really so disappointed with what's happened in the last 20 or 30 years and sort of the official stance and sort of the impression given about the Catholic Church and women. because I really feel if you look at church history, especially, well, all the way through, it was Christianity and Catholicism where women had really extremely important roles in a way that no other religion was giving to women. And I would just take Teresa of Avila. I mean, she rewrote the book on Christian mysticism. And I think 17th century France, the Jesuits ran about 93 93 schools. The Ursulines alone, something like 300. Now, some of these were not very large institutions and so forth, so you have to kind of play with that number. But there was just one order of religious women. So it seems to me the Catholic tradition, as it was lived out, was giving women a lot of important roles and now it's just not us. It's not Catholicism as I understand it through our tradition.
I just make a couple of brief comments. For one thing, out of all of this has come amazing support for women religious. Like I would say, I've probably never felt it at large as much as at the present time. That's the positive. On the other side, at our mother house, for example, we have at least 100 older sisters who are retired in their 80s and 90s, and they probably worked for the church 60 or 70 years. And it's almost like a wet blanket being thrown on them, the deep sadness and what did we do wrong? That just cuts to the core. But Jesus and his followers went about doing good. So we go about living our lives, doing the best that we can. And I think it was Claire who said, I have done what is mine to do. May Christ teach you what is yours.
Corinne Carvalho, a department in theology here. I teach Old Testament. My comments come, and I thought this was a discussion, not a question and answer, so I comment with a bit of a question at the end, primarily from John and Maureen's talks. John, I agree that the Nostra Aetate, ecumenism is at the heart. I would just add, to me, what's at the heart of Dei Verbum isn't just the sacred scripture, but general revelation. That general revelation is the key to so much of what's going on in Vatican II. But I also represent a group that I haven't heard represented here. And Maureen, in your talk this morning, I found what you said similar to things I heard in the smaller groups. You gave the three options for what people can do coming out of Joan Chittister, and the one was to leave. And what I have felt the past couple days is that leaving looks like leaving to go into the wilderness of nothingness. But I represent Vatican II Catholics who've left because we feel like we're going to something else, and that we're going to churches where that Vatican II theology is actually being lived. And I want to ask the sense of the panel's view of reception of Vatican II. Is the reception really only for the Roman Catholic Church, or is it for the church writ large?
What was the question again, please? How'd you put that?
When we think of the reception of Vatican II, or the fruits, the trajectories, as you put it, on Thursday night, do we look for those trajectories, that reception, only within the Roman Church, or is it within the larger Christian body?
Should I call on somebody? Should I call? No. John.
Well, I'll take a stab at that, and I maybe haven't thought about that too much, but I would say certainly within the larger Christian body. I mean, one thing, I hope Michael would agree with me on this, that Sacrosanctum Concilium was not simply, if you look at it simply in terms of its liturgical orientation, not as ecclesiological document, had a huge impact on other churches. So there's a good example of trajectory outside of Roman Catholicism. And so I will stop there because I really haven't thought about it, but maybe...
I will add one thought. I think it's in keeping with what you just said. There is a lovely is the wrong word. There's a very powerful 5-volume series of videos out on Vatican II. They've been out for about since the last 30 years, I think. Faithful Revolution. I'm not sure if you've ever seen them, but they're well worth seeing. And I think the very first one opens up, and the whole theme of these videos is had it not been for Vatican II. And the the very first one opens up with Robert McAfee Brown, who was probably one of the most outstanding Protestant theologians who has died within the last few years. But he opens the videos collection up by saying, had it not been for Vatican II, we Protestants would still be called schismatics and heretics instead of separated brethren. So I do believe that the more I learn about this council, it did touch our church, of course, our tradition, but it made us more appealing and more affable or more compliant. I mean, I think other traditions looked at us in a different way. We weren't the big bad bullies with the triumphalistic stick, but the ones who had come to realize maybe we don't have all the answers. And so I think that's a good opening to dialogue with other with traditions other than our own. The other thing that I thought that you raised at the very beginning, which is very important, and I don't want to dismiss it as, well, that's not the path that people should take. Joan Chittister does mention 3 crossroad moments. You quit, all right, and you go along, or the second one sounds more like what you just described, and that is you go with like-minded people and you live according to that way, or the third is you stand and you fight against the status quo. I've learned enough from Vatican II to know that these decisions are decisions that are made by the heart, these decisions that are made by the conscience. And I believe it's Gaudium et Spes that says, we listen to the inner sanctuary of our heart where we hear the voice of God. And so I would be the last one to say, well, I think this one might be stronger than the other. I think this is between myself and my God, and not in a relativistic manner, but in a genuine, searching manner for what makes me authentic and real to other people.
Larry Martin, Church of Kateri, which is the buffalo skin place that Michael Joncas was talking about. But my question is not about liturgical enculturation. It's about the question that's come up several times about what went wrong. And in 1965 and around that time, I was a seminary student studying theology at the Catholic University of America. And it was a time of great excitement, of course. I mean, some of the professors, not very many, it seemed like hadn't heard about it, but most of them had, and they were, obviously throwing away their notes and starting over. It was really exciting. And the most exciting person, without a doubt, was Charles Curran. So when, among all this excitement and all this positive feeling about the Vatican Council, there was suddenly a balloon was popped when the trustees of the university, who are basically the American bishops, tried to fire Curran. And the university went on strike and all that kind of stuff. And then almost immediately what should come out but Humanae Vitae, which made people wonder too about, everybody said, the commission, which included lay people, was virtually unanimous in changing the teaching on birth control, and the Pope did not choose to listen. So this whole thing just made people wonder about whether all this excitement about Vatican II was really just a show, I'm overstating a bit maybe, but so my question is, like Maureen just said, what if Vatican II had never happened? What if Humanae Vitae had never happened? What if they didn't succeed in firing Curran? Would that excitement about Vatican II have endured better? Maybe the Catholic view was an unusually tense place at the time, but I doubt it. We lost a lot of good people, clergy and laity, over Humanae Vitae. I just think things would be a lot different, and it hasn't come up really as a cause for why things didn't work very well.
Thank you. Who wants to?
With or without Humanae Vitae, the excitement over Vatican II would have disappeared. It had to disappear. This is the way things work. Time moves on. Just because the excitement disappears does not mean the significance of the council disappears. And I do agree with you that a lot of things that's the Vatican II, is Vatican II, and all the problems in the church and so forth caused by Vatican II. The big turning point, I have to agree with Andrew Greeley, was Humanae Vitae. It was after Humanae Vitae that the number of priests and nuns began to leave the orders and so forth. It was really a traumatic moment. And of course, there were other things going on at the same time. I mean, the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, and all those other, the sexual revolution and so forth. So, unfortunately, 1968 and 69, I mean, these were a crucial moment, and Vatican II got kind of ground up in that meat grinder. And I think that we really have to reckon with that. Let me kind of taking off on that in a wild way, coming back to something Maureen said this morning, quoting from Chichester about memory. And I think in teaching Vatican II, we're not trying to recapture the excitement. We're trying to form Catholic memory. And without memory, you're nothing. Alzheimer's. Knock, knock, nobody there. And as a church, if we don't have a corporate memory, we're nothing. It's all very today and what works and what doesn't work and so forth. So we're the church of the great tradition, and we need to always pass on the tradition. And the tradition now, as sort of articulated for the world, the contemporary world, is Vatican II. So it seems to me what we're doing, we're trying to form, not trying to generate excitement for Vatican II, but simply give people a memory of who and what they are and what their role is in the world. And it seems to me Vatican II is the great articulation of that.
I'd like to get some other questions, please.
Helen Jones. Mine actually is more of a comment at this point, and you've already, I guess, really spoken to it, but it is regarding the role of women. And anyway, I still believe that we have a long way to go. And anyway, I just want to say I'm grateful that that has been spoken to, because from what I can understand, and I have to tell you, I haven't really read all the documents. I've read a number of them, and so I have to admit that. But it really was not, did not seem to me that it was addressed. And I guess I'm glad that the Episcopal collegiality, anyway, it seems like that has been raised here, and that local church has to really be able to make more decisions or more choices for itself. So anyway, I just want to say I really am grateful that I've been able to be here, and it's opened up a lot of good things for me. So anyway, thank you.
Thank you. So I would pass to the next question, please. Yeah.
Hi, Steve Oakey from Boston College. Just real quickly, we've heard a couple times questions about future councils like Rio 1 and so forth. We've also heard a lot about the rise of the laity in terms of theologians, administrators, and ministers, and so forth. My question would be, what effect do you think the rise of the laity will have on future possible councils, especially in light of the reform of the Reform being the official view of the Reform now, and centralization in the church and so forth? So,
wants to.
Someone came up to me during one of the talks today and said, a little distinction would have to be made here, I think, in order to answer that question. If I'm correct, and John will help me here on this one, an ecumenical council the main characters would be the bishops, and they would be the voting, correct?
Well, that's the tradition.
That's the tradition. What we might look to have that might bring about what I was talking about and some others have done is maybe just a general church council where we have true representation of all the people you just mentioned, and it doesn't have to have the same ecumenical council status that that usually is in the hands of the Episcopal members, but that at this point in time, one of the authors I use in my church course says we must never divinize the church, meaning the human church, or any of its structures, all right, because they are always meant to be an instrument pointing somewhere else. And we learned that from the early church. The early church was much more fluid. Of course, they were expecting the Parousia, the end of the world, and so it was a little easier for them to not, set up home. But they gave us that lesson, and so that might be a lesson for us to learn. So maybe a general council where those parties who are interested could come together and make their recommendations to an ecumenical council. But the voice has to be heard, I think.
Okay, then me next.
Yeah, okay. Just a quick comment, and that is, it depends on who gets selected among lay people for whatever kind of a gathering. Lay people are as diverse as clergy and bishops and others. And, if they're, it depends.
Okay, the definition I gave the council the other night, and I think nobody's ever been able to kind of show me wrong, is a meeting principally of bishops gathered in Christ's name who make decisions binding on the church. Principally of bishops. Traditionally, bishops have always had the final vote, but de facto, laity have played a big role in the church. And the Fourth Lateran Council, Pope Innocent III invited all leaders of Christendom, all bishops, all abbots, all rulers, secular rulers, the representatives of the free towns, and so forth. It was a gathering of all Christendom, supposedly. Of course, it was a leadership, but it was representative of all Christians. It's the Fourth Lateran Council, 1215. Moreover, the Council of Trent, of course, was convoked by the popes, but the most, in the long run, the person who was most determinative of the way the council turned out was Emperor Charles V, because he insisted that the council not simply deal with doctrinal issues, but with reform, and especially reform of the Roman Curia, but also other reforms. So that meant that Trent, as it moved on, did not have simply a doctrinal track, but a binary track. Every doctrinal decree had to have a reform decree to go with it. And that's, you can almost say, categorically due to pressure from the laity. Now, it's the rulers of Christendom, but nonetheless. So, as I said, the first 8 councils were called by lay people, including a lay woman, the Empress Irene, for Second Nicaea. So it's not like this is not something that we're inventing in the 21st century. It's there in some kind of new, small form from the very beginning, in some form or other from the very beginning. So I think that's an extremely important point to keep in mind.
Michael, and then we'll have one last question.
Mine goes in slightly different direction, and that's simply to say the impact of technology, I think, is extremely important for us to look at. We have nothing but portraits of the Fathers of Trent. We have photographs of those at Vatican I. At Vatican II, we have tape recordings, and you can hear them droning on in very badly accented Latin. And when the fathers go on too long, you hear the conveners saying, "Tempus, tempus, it's time now, so shut up." It's just wonderful, right? And then they transcribe it all and put it in the acta of the councils. But at least we have that. Well, we have Skype now. We have Skype. We are able to do transcontinental, face-to-face, in real-time conversations. The impact that's going to have on the possibility of these kind of consultations among interested Christians is, I think, incredibly, we barely scratched the surface for what it might mean for the future. So.
Concilium interneticum primum. Okay. Last question.
Gerald Schlabach in the theology department here. I first stood up to make a point similar to that of my colleague, Dr. Carvalho, because we haven't heard hardly anything about the reception of the council beyond the Catholic Church, and I wanted to underscore that. That having been made, I can segue to, since I kind of get the last word here, a word of hope. I've been Roman Catholic for 8 years, and people, of course, ask me, well, why did you become Catholic? And I have trouble explaining because there's no one reason. The best I can do is to look back retrospectively and say, Vatican II, in ways that I didn't realize at the time, had shaped my entire Christian life. I even think I didn't decide to become a Catholic. I just sort of realized I had become one. And, you know, I don't want to take the time here to explain that. But only to end with, whether we're talking about ecumenism, whether we're talking about religious freedom. I mean, one of our challenges in teaching Vatican II is that our students really are already the product of Vatican II in ways that they take for granted. And so the challenge is to help them see why it matters, okay? But that's not necessarily because they're resistant. But in so many ways, Vatican II has shaped our lives, shaped the lives of Christians beyond the Roman Church, way more than a group of cradle Catholics may realize, you know? And so that's also a commentary on the possibilities for new evangelization. There's the whole event, you know, however we want to interpret it, insofar as we embrace it and live it, and hopefully stop arguing about it quite so much, but live it, it is good news. Good news for the world. And two final ways to say this. Part of what attracted me to Catholicism was Catholic. Some of my Catholic professors at Notre Dame were probably more liberal than I am, but who were doggedly sticking with the church. And that quality of loyalty, even in hard times, itself is, for some of us, attractive, because it says something about that community life that Father Michael is referring to. So, damn it, let's stick together in this. And
You want to answer?
Amen.
You want to answer or not?
a last word.
Okay.
A friend of mine likes to say, you know, people often criticize the Catholic Church because, you know, it changes at a glacial speed, right? When glaciers move, they reshape the face of the earth.
So, I invite our panelists to stay where they are, and I invite Bernie Brady.
Four concluding comments. One, if you have any comments or remarks, please fill out this form and stick it in the box. We have a reaction box. Number two, thank you without applause. First of all, we thank Archbishop Flynn. We will write a letter from all of us here thanking him for the liturgy and the spectacular homily yesterday. We thank our 30 presenters. We thank St. Thomas Bookstore, Liturgical Press. I thank my colleagues in the theology department and campus ministry who planned the conference and the liturgy. I thank all of you for your attention and your participation. We have worked you hard. Number three, thank yous with applause. Our keynote speakers. I would like to thank the students who, there were about 6 or 8 students who came, who volunteered and showed you around and welcomed you. There's one remaining, Bridget. On behalf of the 6 or 8 students, here's Bridget taking that. Thirdly, this is also a thank you with applause. If you've learned anything over the past couple of days, you've learned that Wonder Woman lives here. Ms. Lori Diamond is our administrative assistant. Unbelievable. I know all of you had a chance to talk with her and asked her about parking and eating, and she welcomed everybody, and she's unbelievable. Thank you, Lori, from all of us, way down deep. Fourthly, I'm going to end with one sentence, and it's a sentence from the council, so it's a long sentence.
But it's a sentence that's formed me as a theologian, as a Catholic, and as a person, and it's a sentence that all of you are familiar with. The joys and the hopes, the griefs and anxieties of the people of this age, especially those who are poor or in any way afflicted. These are the joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of the followers of Christ. Thank you very much.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you. I want to write those. I want to get a copy.